Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charles Allen. I'm the Ward 6 council member from the District of Columbia and also the co-chair of our DMVMoves task force. And let me officially call our second meeting of the task force to order. I want to thank our good friends at WMATA for hosting us here in their Prince George's County offices. It's also a great opportunity to be able to see a lot of our different transit hubs throughout the region, and I think we had at least one Orange Line train car that had most of the DC delegation and a lot of our Virginia friends all in the same car. So it was great to be able to take Metro and come here so wonderfully and conveniently. As you know, this is a co-chaired effort, and so I'm honored to be able to serve with Paul Smedberg as the co-chair. So let me turn this over to Mr. Smedberg.
Good afternoon, everyone. And this plastic is still on that. Wow, it's so new, Randy.
So fresh.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm WMATA Board Vice Chair Paul Smedberg and co-chair with Chair Allen here at DMVMoves Task Force. Before we get started, I'd like to highlight a few things that the WMATA Board received this morning, and I think it's really exciting for us to all know this. First, our ridership continues to grow in the region. Last Thursday, combined Metrobus and Metro Rail ridership was the highest non-special event day with 912,000 riders. And we had 3 of our 4 highest ridership days since 2020 in the month of September. Tuesday and Wednesday of last 2 weeks had the 4 busiest morning rush hour ridership peaks since 2020. The highest level of customer satisfaction in recent years, driven by good all-day frequent service and improvements in personal safety. Metro Rail customer satisfaction, it is a record high of 90%, and Metrobus customer satisfaction is 79%, the highest level in years. All 98 stations across the Metro Rail system now have more secure retrofitted fare gates to deter fare evasion. The improvements have led to an 82% drop in fare evasion in the Metro Rail system. Last week, the team completed the final stations. And those are all things that the board received today, and we're really proud of the work that the WMATA team is doing on that regard. So before we begin the formal meeting here, I'd like to turn the floor over to Maryland Senator, who represents Prince George's County, Senator Malcolm Augustine, to provide welcoming remarks. Senator Augustine.
Thank you, Chair Smedberg, co-chairs Smedberg and Allen. As was mentioned, I am Malcolm Augustine, State Senator. You actually are in my district, actually. So welcome to District 47 inside of Prince George's County. And welcome to Maryland. And for many, it's probably don't necessarily, I hope it was easy for you to get down here to New Carrollton. It's a pretty straight shot. I thought it would make sense to just go through a little bit of who we are from a WMATA funding standpoint here within the WMATA Compact. We obviously joined, as you others did, back in 1965 when we passed the Compact. The thing that I would just highlight over what has occurred over time are a couple different things. Obviously, we are set up a little bit differently than than Virginia, where we are set up as a state. We pay for WMATA. As a state, we consider WMATA to be a state asset that we are supportive of at the state level. We also participated in 2008 when we agreed to a $50 million match to match the federal grant program for the capital program. So we've had this long-standing commitment to supporting WMATA, including working with the other jurisdictions on the dedicated funding for the capital in 2018. And then, of course, we led the way in 2024 by stepping forward with the $143 million for the needs of Metro, because Metro is very important to us. Just as far as who we are 27 rail stations in Prince George's and Montgomery County. We have a significant number of rail trips, bus trips, and Metro access trips. We have historically here in Prince George's County had less of a development than perhaps parts of Virginia and also the District of Columbia. And so we've really tried to work hard on fixing that, including here in Prince George's County, including here at this place right here at New Carrollton. Now, New Carrollton, when I was actually a part of the board of WMATA, I was on the board with Chair Smedberg actually for a period of time, you are sitting in a parking lot right now. I mean, it was all parking lot out here. For those who did come here, maybe you did to catch the Metro train at New Carrollton or something like that. It was all parking lot. And over the course of the last decade, we have seen this activation here and the JD potential that is here, which of course helps Metro as a whole, as we're able to drive more ridership for Metro and also drive more revenue for the state that has obviously the need to support what is going on here for Metro. As I said before, it was just pretty much a freestanding spot here, but it has this unbelievable connectivity that I will share with you all. We feel so strongly about this place because as you look over there to the side, you do see the MARC train, you do see Amtrak, you do see New Carrollton Metro Station, and if you were to go right across, you would see the Purple Line is also coming into here, which will connect to, that's going to also connect to Montgomery County, as well as Route 50, which is an important road, and 495 and 95. So we feel really good about what's here and how this can be a contributor to Metro in the future. And I just say welcome to you all, to Prince George's County and to Maryland. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Senator Augustine, and thank you for representing not only this region, but partnering with us on this important work. We do have a special request. We do have one public comment. The chair, co-chair, and I have decided we'll let Mr. Bill Orleans speak. Mr. Orleans, you have 30 seconds. Or, I'm sorry, 60 seconds. Yep.
Opportunity for there to be public comment today. When the two boards first met back in May in that hotel, it took some effort to find one of the participants to make certain by request that there would be public comment at the task force meetings, and the answer was, of course, there would be. When I first looked at the agenda for today, I did not see that time stated as such, and since I was not in Arlington, I can only presume that it being so recently after that first meeting that there was public comment. I'd like an answer to that. But I would hope at the next meeting, presumably in the district, there will be designated time for the public to speak. Essentially, I'm going to say now what I've been saying and whining about for quite some time. The advisory boards, the governance and the community advisory work groups should be open to the public, at least to listen to, if not to verbally participate. And I take exception that that decision has been made that they should not be open to the public. Lastly, with regard to the community advisory group, there's a long-standing transit advocacy group in the region, headquartered in Montgomery County, Action Committee for Transit. It's just inconceivable to me that no one would have thought to invite the Action Committee for Transit to serve on the community advisory group. And I hope that will be rectified. Thank you very much. Jose?
Thank you, Mr. Orleans.
Thank you very much. As we move into our next agenda items, I think that everybody here was at our last meeting. So rather than take the time to run around the table, having everybody reintroduce themselves, here's what we're going to do. When it comes time where you've got a question or a comment you want to make, if you would, just make sure you introduce yourself and your jurisdiction. That'll help be a refresher for everybody around the table when we do that. Since we last met in June, we've got, obviously, we are the task force. We have advisory groups that have been doing good work. So we have our Government Partners Advisory Group, which has been chaired by Fairfax County Executive Brian Hill. And we have our Community Partners Advisory Group, which has been chaired by the Greater Washington Board of Trade CEO Jack McDougall. They have each met 3 times to move the work of this initiative forward. And they're joining us today to be able to help share some of their work and their recommendations with our larger task force. We also, of course, are joined by our DMVMoves facilitators, Nuria Fernandez and Nick Donahue, both of whom bring a wealth of knowledge to the table, and they've been working very closely with each of the advisory groups as well as the task force. So what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Ms. Fernandez. She's going to proceed with our first agenda item as we start to report out our advisory group work. So Ms. Fernandez, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair of the task force. I am Nuria Fernandez, a co-facilitator, together with Nick Donahue, who was earlier introduced. I want to thank all of you for coming back. It's been a good 3 months since we last had a conversation about what was necessary to move this region. And you all were very clear as a task force to provide guidance and direction for what you wanted to see the advisory groups focus on. So over the next 100 minutes or so, we are going to hear from not only the two chairs of the advisory groups, but also I will be summarizing together with Nick Donahue the very good work that the 100 or so members that comprise both advisory groups have been involved with. And we'll be presenting areas that are close, that have the potential for generating cost efficiencies, both from an operational perspective and also through some administrative opportunities. We also then talk about review the costs for the region. You know, how do we get here? And the transit services that are necessary to continue serving this region, in addition to the current revenues that are available and the gap that continues to grow. That delta and the projected funding needs will also be shared with you all. And the bottom line is that the mechanics that are necessary to provide a seamless service throughout this region, which is what we've been hearing time and time again, not only from the advisory members, but also through a survey that I will summarize as well, and the needs to meet the objectives of this initiative. So before I review with you how we captured, we believe we were able to capture your direction on creating that vision, I am going to turn to the two co-chairs of the advisory groups, Brian Hill, who chairs the Government Partners Advisory Group, and then Jack McDougall, who chairs the Community Partners Advisory Group. We'll start with Jack.
Thanks, Nuria. Thanks, everyone. Chair Smedberg, Chair Allen, thank you for the opportunity to update you. As you mentioned, we've had 3 advisory committee meetings. We're making progress on it. I'll share a couple of high-level observations. I know Nuria and Nick will get into the details around it. One thing is that when we started in our first meeting, we really did get bogged down in what I would consider to be some technical issues about reliability and frequency and issues like that. But we were quickly able to elevate to a more strategic level. It's really important from the community partners' perspective and the business community is to remember, what is it that we need this system to do? So we can run on time, but if it's not doing what we need it to do, then that's a bigger challenge. And what we needed to do, and Nuria will get into the vision that we are proposing here, is, we needed to stimulate economic growth. We needed to improve our global competitiveness. We needed to help us achieve climate goals. We needed to do a whole number of things, inclusion and social goals that we have across the region. So that's why we need this system. And then that opens the door to some other conversations that we were having too, is that whether or not somebody rides the system every day, they're still dependent on people who do. So this really is a regional asset. It's not just, isolated. It really affects all of us. And that's really important when we start thinking about the funding mechanisms and how we're going to structure this as we go forward. And so we made a lot of progress on that, and happy to answer questions later on about any of those issues, but Nuria and Nick will go through that in more detail. But what that then led us into was conversations about how do we think about the various systems across the region. And from our perspective, we're a little bit agnostic about that. We think there's a lot of opportunity here to integrate more effectively, to bring all these different systems together. And it's all about the customer experience in the end, and how do we get customers from point A to point B in the most seamless way possible. And so you'll see quite a few of our recommendations are based on looking at those opportunities and how we can move those forward. And then also too, as has been alluded to here, is that really understanding the cost structure. From the business community's perspective, we need to understand what the costs are so that we can understand better what we're funding and what the return on that investment is going to be in the long run. And so digging into that. And what I would say is, and from what I know, and I still have questions around this, and so does the advisory committee, and we're just starting to scratch into that. But what I do know, it's a good story. But we need to get that story out there much more than we have already. Because, as everyone here in this room knows, there are a lot of perceptions out there around Metro. And we've got to put a lot of those to the side if we're going to move this forward. And so those are some top observations that I've had in the work that we've been doing. And again, as we get into the details, Nuri and Nick, happy to provide any further guidance or answer questions.
I think Jack stole all my notes. However, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. The group that I've been working with has been, as Jack stated, we've been in the weeds. We've been high level. We've been trying to figure out how to make this all work. What does Metro need to look like? What is it looking like today? From the Northern Virginia CAOs to the District of Columbia District Administrator, Mr. How are you, sir? And to our friends in Maryland, Mr. McAndrew, we're looking at the financial structure and what it is that it needs to be. I believe that the Metro staff, led by Mr. Clark and his team, have provided us with a lot of details, but there's a lot more details to look at, to unearth, to figure out. And then, as my chairman said on my way in today, how much is this going to cost us? And what is it going to look like as we move forward? Obviously, we are a region. We are not just Maryland, and we're not just a district, and we're not just Virginia. We are the DMV. So we need to figure out through the goals that are structured through Nick and Nuria that they're going to go over today, also the financial component. Obviously, being in Fairfax County, we need to understand how we get to yes and what is yes going to look like. So we've been challenged with looking at a system that needs to be the best in world class, yes, and provide us with services for all. However, we need to also pull in and understand what it is that it's going to take to get us there. This group that I've been working with has been spot on in trying to boil it down, but now we will be in committee structures moving forward, and we will come back to this group with some expectations, some things that we need to push forward, as well as some things that we probably can't get to. But we all are working hard together to make sure that we give you a finished product.
Thank you very much. I really want to say thanks again to Jack and Brian, because it takes a lot of effort. I mean, we've asked individuals to be members of the various advisory groups, and it's all volunteer, and they're there and they show up because there's a great interest to engage and invest with their thoughts, with their ideas and recommendations into this process. So let's go back to, why are we here? The task force directed us to take a look at, one, putting the customer first. So everything that you're going to hear today is through the lens of the customer. What is it that needs to happen in this region so that they can use the system, that it becomes intuitive, that wayfinding, that decisions about transferring from one mode of transportation, one service, one system to another does not require a PhD, that there's ways that we can continue moving and we can continue ensuring that we're improving their experience, that we're improving the service, and that we're integrating this great network. There's been a lot of investment made throughout this region in moving people by bus and rail. So that needs to be better integrated. So one of, I think what has been summarized, the work at both of the advisory groups is on this slide. And again, punctuating the frequency, the quality of service, the maximizing the use and value of the existing infrastructure and assets, integrating and being more efficient. But there is some future topics that will be covered at a future meeting. And those talk about those items in that second column, and we will touch on those later. So let me go now to the first action that was asked of us. It was, we need you all to come back with a vision, craft a vision statement that captures the values, that captures the expectations, and that captures the reality of what this region is and does, and what it needs to continue doing and enhance to be world class. So I'm going to read this to you. It has had many authors, and we believe that this version is a good version, so we have coalesced around this version. Transit is the background of an integrated, world-class mobility network that makes the nation capital region a thriving global economy, a preferred home, and a leader in innovation, environmental sustainability, and social equity. I want to draw your attention to make it a preferred home, because we all know that that's what drives decisions about where you decide you want to live and the availability, what the existing conditions are for mobility to get from point A to point B, which we've heard already, origin to destination. So we'd like to pause here, because this is the opportunity for the task force to give us their consensus and/or share thoughts about this statement.
Thanks, Nuria. So if anyone has any questions or comments for our two chairs, or wants to make a general comment, a brief comment, if you could just flip up your tent, I think that's the easiest way. Chair Randall, you were first.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Mr. Hill and Mr. McDougall, thank you for all your work. I know you all have been meeting throughout the summer when some of us were not doing that. I'm Phyllis Randall. I'm the chair of Loudoun County, Virginia. When I read the DMVMoves vision, which I would not try to change because you can only have so many authors, but what I notice in here is that we talk about a thriving global economy. And when both of you spoke, you correctly spoke about the fact that Metro is a regional asset. I've said this before, I will keep saying it. I believe some of our language needs to move to Metro is a national asset. We can't talk about having this be a thriving global economy in Metro. The reason our Metro is a national asset is because we're moving the federal government workforce to a large degree. And so I think that at times we have to broaden this out and make sure that more people understand, not just people in the region, people in Richmond, people all over the country, how important Metro is. And so just to change that thinking a little bit from not just the region, but to the nation, and Metro being important to the nation, changing that language to some degree will then match the language of the DMVMoves vision statements. That's just a thought that I have. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chair Randall.
Do we
Mr.
respond to that?
Yes, of course.
All right, thank you. You know, I could not respond to that. Sorry, sir.
Oh, go ahead.
Chair Randall, you're absolutely correct. It is a national issue. However, when we look at our funding capabilities, we're looking at it as a regional funding source, at least in my way of looking at it. That helps nationally everybody that we move through our system. If we could get national funding, I would absolutely add that to the rubric of what we are trying to do here today, but we were a little bit constrained with what we are dealing with, in my humble opinion. And I'm not stating that what you said is not accurate. It's just that in my box, our box, I'm looking at it from a DMV standpoint, which predicates the national standpoint. I also want to acknowledge Clark Mercer's group, who is helping us with our groups as well. I mentioned everybody but Clark. These are one of the things that I probably should be writing down when I come speak at these meetings, but Clark, I want to say thank you to you and your team as well. Anything to add, sir?
Yeah, no, I agree with what you're saying as well. And we've talked through a lot of these iterations, and I think everything you're saying is embedded in here. So when I read it, I hear a lot of what you were saying. And one way that we captured some of that too is when we get to the goals and other things as it flows through. But again, this is a draft, and we're happy to take input into how we move that forward. But transit, we were thinking not just Metro, but we were thinking all transit across the region and how do we integrate that. So we didn't want to be Metro explicit around that. And then for this region, the National Capital Region, embedded the fact that our transit systems are a national asset and how do they use that. But we're competing in a global economy. We're not just competing against Austin and Boulder and other places, but we're competing against Singapore and places like that. So trying to think more globally in what it is that we need to do to stay competitive and thriving. So anyway, but I very much appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Yeah, and I too would just very quickly acknowledge your comments, Ms. Randall, and also indicate that the 34 or so words that are in this vision are what it is that we would like to see achieve, and then once we get talking about the hows and the greater details, so we truly appreciate that comment.
Mr. McAndrew, do you pass for now? Okay. Okay, seeing no other comments or questions, Ms. Fernandez?
Okay, so should we assume that the task force is ready to go with this? Fantastic. Thank you very much, and thanks to all who worked on this effort. Okay, so in addition to the vision statement, you said come up with goals that are smart, that are very specific, that are measurable, that are going to be accountable, and clearly that are going to relate to the outcomes that we have established, but make sure that it's done in our timeline. So clearly, we identified 6 goals, and again, those all talk to making public transportation a preferred travel choice. And the emphasis here, again, is on a preferred, not the preferred, because we recognize that when individuals walk through the threshold of their front door, they have decisions to make as to how they're going to get to that next destination. But we would like for public transportation to be one of those choices that's being considered. We've heard a lot of commentary from you all and others about ensuring that the service that's provided is seamless, that it is clear how that travel navigation is going to happen, and that it's consistent so that the customer doesn't have to spend a lot of time trying to figure it out, but just concentrate on where they're going. Growing that ridership, looking at these high-capacity corridors, looking at corridors that have high-quality public transportation that could benefit from density, and making sure that that density is transit-oriented, community-geared density. Then the connections to the opportunities, because it's going to build that economic prosperity. Enhancing the region's quality of life. You all have said a number of times that this is an area that's congested, that we have environmental attainment issues, we want to breathe cleaner air, and yes, we all agree that we need to paint this very important region a cleaner shade of green. And that's where the achieving the goals on congestion reduction and how that happens through public transportation, in addition to ensuring that it's fair and equitable. And then looking at the reliability and predictability. You want to know that the system is going to be there, that you can rely on that system, and that there is funding to deliver that reliable, predictable system. And then, of course, you can't do any of this without people. And it's in the whole workforce development and that emphasis on the people who are behind the wheel, in the cab of the train, and then the people who are in the offices and making things happen, maintaining those vehicles, maintaining the facilities. So those are the goals. We hope that we have captured the initial ideas that were shared around the table, and I will pause here, see if there are any questions.
Absolutely. So as folks have had a chance to take a look at these 6 identified goals, similarly what we just did with the vision, I want to give folks a chance if you have any specific questions or comments on this. And I think the best style we have is if you turn table 10 up. I think we've also been told if everybody turns their mic on and all the red lights are on, the cameras just go nuts and they don't know who to focus on. So if you'll remember to turn your mic off. All right, I'm not seeing any.
Okay, seeing no comments, Jack?
Oh, sorry.
Just one, these are not in priority order. So these are just for us to consider as a whole. And so, you know, I mean, some of these we're talking a lot more about than others. So just to set that out there.
Actually, I think we do have Mr. Sargent. I see your tent go up.
Just curious, will these goals be kind of broken down and defined a little more concretely in terms of measurable outcomes that are going to be tried to achieve by what is laid out here?
Yeah, the intent is for these goals to serve as the guidepost as we begin to have conversations about policies that we believe can generate the operational efficiencies, operational and administrative efficiencies. And, you know, interestingly enough, and that's going to be, I'll cover this in the next slide, is to talk about what we heard from the public through the customer surveys and how those affirm the direction that we're taking. But these goals are the ones that, again, measurable. So they, as we start to assign the action plans around what we want to achieve, these will be crosswalked to that action plan. Okay.
All right, I don't see any more now. Okay, Ms. Fernandez.
Okay, great. So yes, we did indicate back in June, you may recall, that we were going to be issuing a survey. That survey went out, and the feedback from the survey came back at the end of August. 20,000 households receive these surveys, and the responses were 5,000, so that's 25% response, which is very large, very significant, given that this was external. It's usually 10 to 15% is what you get back. And that again shows the importance of the topic that is being discussed and the interest in the community and those who are writing the system and those who could write the system but looking to see how their commute can be improved are trying to drive the direction to one that would give them the right outcome. So looking on the screen, 80% of the respondents said, we want more frequent service, and we want the service to happen, more service availability during different times of the day, no longer looking at peak periods that were the basis for developing schedules. Both on the bus side and on the rail side, the challenges are not frequent enough. Too many transfers on the bus, lack of real-time information that can give you that real-time decision-making as to when you're going to leave, when you're going to arrive, and that the priorities should be focused on more frequent services. Off-peak, outside of peak, and many of the operators are experiencing a different peak because there's different travel behavior, travel patterns that are taking place for multiple reasons, and then the late-night service. Also looking at bus-only lanes, because that gives you the advantage of having fast, frequent service in addition to better connections and routes serving the various communities. And then on the rail side, interestingly enough, there was feedback on that the stops needed to be closer to where people were and their destination, and that the service was not frequent enough. So the priority there that they ask is for more frequent off-peak and late night, and these are starting to mirror the bus as well as what the connections are and longer operating hours, so that if individuals or workers in the service industry and others needed to access that service after some of the lines and some of the bus routes were no longer in operation, you know, what was the response to that? Okay, so then now let's talk about the areas that both the work with the help of the project team, in addition to the advisor groups, we were able to capture. There are a number of opportunity areas, and we're going to be focusing on 6 for today's discussion, cover some others in the future. But these are opportunity areas of things that could happen, should have happened, but there are always hurdles, so we're always dealing with the 3 elements: the people, the processes, and tools. And when I talk about tools, we're talking about equipment and facilities that were a stopgap to advancing some of these things. But this now as being the will of this task force to try to figure out how can we identify more efficiencies. Let's look at what we have and where the money has gone, and see if there is opportunities to extricate through combining, co-locating, and thinking differently about how we deliver service. We have captured those, looking at fares and the opportunities to create a transferability. We're also looking to address through the fares, looking to address the discounts and who gets them, and making sure that there's parity and similarities throughout those decisions. Then there's the shared service guidelines, and if you think about transit and how it operates and how we measure performance. If we're talking about we should be considering more services, then what does that mean? What times of day does everyone operate throughout the day? How frequent is that service? And if we're going to be collecting data so that we can compare apples to apples on performance, we want to make sure that the metrics that are being used and the criteria to develop that data is similar. So that's one of the second area. The other area is wayfinding. Again, these in the left column are all focused on how we're going to improve that service for the customers. And wayfinding, transportation without wayfinding is really a nightmare. You really need to be able to give individuals who are trying to navigate a system, and in this case, public transportation, going from bus to bus, bus to train, and the like, that wayfinding, the information that the customers have available to them to know where they are, that the maps, the colors on the maps, the numbering of the buses, and all of the amenities at these stops start to look similar in some way, so that you know that you're in this region and that there is that integration. The bus priority, if you're going to increase frequency on the bus and that service, then looking at what are some of these tools that are available through whether it's signal priority, it's also looking at the high frequency routes, and it's making those buses move faster, and the decisions that will require engagement by city and other local officials to make designations and designing and identifying those changes in those routes. On the administrative and the cost efficiencies, these are areas that are internal to operations, but that can really generate some significant savings in the long run. This is not all going to happen overnight. Shared use. Every transit operator has a facility where they house their administrative functions, HR, IT, legal, and financial, and then they also do procurement. And if you are procuring, and I'll just give an example, if you're buying buses, but you're a small operator and buying a half a dozen buses, can you imagine the value of a group procurement where now the operators are in the driver's seat when it comes to negotiating a price, because you're talking about pulling together dollars that can afford for a better negotiating posture with manufacturers. And that's just one example, but there are other elements of areas that are being procured that are very similar, and in grouping those. So that's one of those that can generate some cost savings, but also generate efficiencies, because everyone is buying the same things and maybe using the same firms to help them organize that procurement. And then lastly is the training. Another area where looking at the opportunities to co-locate, create a training program where all operators, all maintenance personnel can be trained, go through their certification, and even looking at inspection, creating these similarities and trying to just make sure that we are turning over every stone for things that are, at this point, should be of high consideration. Because once you do that, then you can start talking about integration, because now you're all moving, singing from the same score sheet with the same level of information. So these are the 6 areas that will be the focus of the first review. The plan is to bring an action plan to the November meeting. We will be working, if you concur, we'll be working through the advisory groups to create subgroups and point of contact leads that will be accountable for doing the deeper dive, drilling down, and coming up with the activities necessary to make this possible. But we're bringing it up here because we need your help in getting the operators and government staff and others to help with data and any other type of support necessary to advance this initiative.
Thank you, Ms. Fernandez. The co-chair and I have heard from a lot of folks, and a lot of this is, I think, pretty obvious to just about everyone. Does anyone have any questions or comments on any of these bullet points? Dr. Lowe.
Hi, thanks. Yeah. Curious to hear from the advisory groups about whether the discussion around administrative and cost efficiencies, it will be inclusive of audits. Because I've heard so many times, we have to stop running transit as a jobs program, but that should include jobs for lawyers and accountants.
Thank you, Tracy. And the Metro Board, as you know, has talked a lot about this. We have we have the general audit, and then we have like 8 other audits that we have to go through every year.
I wish it was 8. It'd
Yeah,
be great if we could limit it to 8.
Chair,
Okay, we will make a point of that. Thank you.
The answer is yes, and that's kind of a catch-all for a lot of the duplication that happens. Sometimes Virginia will add a requirement, Maryland will add a similar requirement, the DC, the feds will, localities will, and I don't think anyone intentionally is trying to add, but over time it's cumulative, and you look at it, and it results in Metro or transit agencies having to jump through a lot of hoops. A lot of times the audits aren't apples to apples, so can we agree on one standard, the highest standard possible, that would pass the test in all 3 jurisdictions? And I would just add a quick note to what Nuri said. A lot of these recommendations you've seen before over the last couple of decades, and when we look at all of those recommendations and efforts, there's a common thread, which is the group, whether it's DMVMoves or by whatever the name of that effort is, it makes a high-level recommendation or set of recommendations, and then the group dissolves. And the region looks at, we look at each other and say, okay, what exactly did we mean by this recommendation? Who has the lead on this recommendation? And what incentives and deterrents exist for people, transit agencies, Metro, to participate and get these recommendations actualized? So the idea here is if folks agree with these general areas, we are going to come back while DMVMoves still exists as an entity and say, this is the recommendation, here's who owns it, here's what each transit agency needs to do to implement it, here's the time frame to do it, and then we really need to look to our electeds to hold all of us, COG, WMATA, our transit partners, accountable for implementing these. So we want to do as many of these while this group is still together, recognizing some of them might have a longer lead time. Okay, when this group no longer exists, who's going to house that recommendation, who has the lead, and what's the feedback loop to getting it done? So that's when folks ask what's different about this effort, we're trying to move these recommendations along at speed to get them implemented while we still exist. And if that can't happen, then what is the guidebook, the plan to get it done afterwards?
Chair McKay, followed by Senator Augustine.
Thank you very much. First, I just want to go backwards for a moment, just a question on what we heard from the public, and then I do have a comment on the initial recommendations. The public that was surveyed, this is largely existing customers that were surveyed. I mean, do we know how many of these would be potential customers versus how many are existing customers? Because obviously the answers to these questions would vary quite substantially whether you're an existing customer or not.
Okay, thank you for that question. No, it was not just users of the system. We have data. Slide 8 in your background materials will have the breakdown as to who all were contacted.
Yeah,
and
I see that. It just doesn't tell me if they're existing customers or not. That's what I'm interested in learning at some point.
we
Okay.
can get that information back to the task force.
I
for sure.
appreciate that. And then on slide 10, just a cautionary note on the second bullet, adopt shared service guidelines for when and how often transit operates and measure performance. I would just remind everybody here something that's obvious, which is there is great geography differences across our region. And so understanding how we measure performance and how often transit operates could be different for various reasons, depending on the goals of the jurisdictions in those particular areas, depending on whether they even have any fare box recovery. And so I think when we're looking at bullet 2, I just want to make sure we're cognizant of where these are and how that can steer what the performance levels actually are. Because I have very high performing routes that are doing what they're supposed to do. Then I have other routes that aren't very high performing, but are there because they're solving other regional goals and other jurisdictional goals that we might have and we decide are worth doing. So I would just point that out. And then the only other last thing, the group procurements jumps out at me because for those of us in local government, we're used to writing contracts all the time across the region for just about everything we do. And so is this not something that currently takes place at Metro with any of the state, federal, or local partners? Because if that's the case, we do need to dig deeper on that, because as a matter of general principle, local governments do this with just about everything else they purchase.
Thank you, Mr. McKay. Senator Augustine, followed by Mr. Donahue, followed by Deputy Secretary McAndrew.
Thank you very much. I too am I know we stopped on slide 9, but it's a combination of slide 9 and slide 10, because it seems that we're doing the recommendations from slide 9, but there's some of the things that can be incorporated, I think, from the 10th slide. On one being on the adoption of the shared service guidelines, whether or not there was consideration within that of the scheduling across systems, interoperability of systems, and planning coordination, and whether or not that was a part of that discussion. So that to me is something that I just want to elevate and ask if that was a part of this conversation.
Yeah, let me address that. Thank you very much, Senator, for that question. And yes, as a matter of fact, as I had noted earlier, all of the items in the goals, in some way, even if the wording is not exact, will be reflected in the work that we're doing in this first grouping of policy areas for consideration. There are additional areas that will be brought to the task force at the November meeting. The purpose of having the goals and of focusing on service guidelines is because it's one of those areas that floated to the top. You can't have the frequency, you can't have the predictability if there are different decisions that are being made. But we need to understand what those decisions are, what are the rationale, justification for those decisions, and see how we can create something that can provide the customer, again, the focus is the customer, can provide that predictability, can provide that reliability, and that comfort to use public transportation. Yes, so your point is well taken.
Okay, I just want to make sure that that's elevated and is a part of what's going on, and that it also includes the regional rail as well, because it doesn't feel to me like we're talking necessarily as much about that as an additional part of this conversation. I just think that that's important that that's a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Augustine. Mr. Donahue stepped out of the room, so Deputy Secretary McAndrew will turn to you, followed by Deputy Secretary Sargent.
Thank you, Chair. So to an idea, and I don't know if it's a good idea, so maybe I shouldn't say this, but it's an idea. We run a lot of bus service in the DMV, and to Chair McKay's point is, each jurisdiction sometimes funds them differently and have different goals and priorities. So maybe shared service guidelines or standards across the entire DMV might be an aspirational intent, but maybe forever aspirational. But there is one to maybe think about, a shared map or shared service standard for high frequency, right? That's something we can agree on. So if you want to be on a map that is, showing the bus service for the region, maybe we say that you have some level of service threshold that should be expected, because that's something that, that clearly the riders are asking for and wanting, understanding, you might have a different map for a more localized constituency. Just an idea. Again, it might not be a good idea. The last item, Clark, you made a good point, and my kind of constant with both the WMATA board and elsewhere is that a lot of this stuff is good. It's a little bit of retreads. What's making a difference is there's momentum in the immediate near term. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that when we get to the end of this, we need to actually be asking ourselves, what is the future for that regional convening group when this goes away? So I would just say, whether it be on here now or a, dotted line rectangle, we should put something in as a TBD. So we answer that question in the future before we're all said and done here.
See, I see a lot of shaking heads, Joe. That was not a bad idea. Nick?
Well, and Joe, I just wanted to respond to your comment because a few folks have brought that up. And this is a huge part of the discussion with the transit providers when we talked about this. So when you see something about like service guidelines, like Chairman McKay, that does not mean that every bus route in Fairfax County should be like every bus route in Montgomery County. They should not be. What we're more talking about is based on context and other things that you have like standards for like types of service. So if we're going to call certain service high frequency, then it should try and meet certain standards. There may be service that isn't supposed to be high frequency. You might be doing coverage or other things that achieves a valuable regional goal, and that would have a different type of standard. So I really just want to make sure that is said out loud as we have these discussions, because the folks in the Government Partners Advisory Group would be very upset if we did not make that clear, because they were very, very clear with us. But I also say this does bring up another issue, and Dr. Lowe, it gets to a point you raised, which is there are a lot of well-intended things that we've all put in place, over time. And as we move forward with these various policies, you may hear from your transit agencies, if you oversee one of them, that, hey, someone is talking about something that we've made this decision 10 years ago. And there are going to be trade-offs with local control and regional benefits that will be a part of this discussion, but we're all going to be at the table and involved in those discussions as they happen. And the important thing is that we all work together to find that right balance.
Thank you, Mr. Donahue. Deputy Secretary Sargent, followed by Co-Chair Allen and Chair Ehrlich after that.
Thank you. Is there a target or goal for cost savings that are hoped to be achieved by the administrative and cost efficiency?
That is an area that we're looking to once these goals, these focus areas are given back to the advisory groups and they go in and do their deep dives. One of the things that we're asking them to do is to identify the timeline. We don't want to talk about timelines now because we don't really have a good sense of the level of the effort that's going to be necessary. Mm-hmm. But clearly, between now and the end of this initiative, there will be very specific. Most of these things would have been started and will be ongoing.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, is there an idea of the rough order of magnitude in terms of the potential? Like, what's the reach goal here? Is it $1 billion? Is it $10 million?
So Deputy Secretary Sargent, I think that's a very fair question, and I think on all of these, what I hope you all will expect of us, if you again concur with the recommendations that have come from the advisory group, is when we come back to you in November, we're going to have more information on exactly which services we think should target and what the potential benefits could be. I don't think today we can tell you of all the services provided which ones are most ripe and which ones don't have much promise. And in fact, we even surfaced some newer ones at our last meeting where, today every transit agency has a call center you call when you have a question about the service. Why do we have that? At some of these stops, you even have 3 transit agencies providing service, and so if you're waiting for Dash, you have to call Dash. If you're waiting for WMATA, you have to call WMATA. Like, to me, that is a ripe opportunity. What I can't tell you today is that we know every single ripe opportunity and have had the chance to go through it and identify it. But if today, you all as a group concur, as a task force, we then as the advisory groups can go back and do this level of due diligence. Again, you all gave us a charge. We've done some initial homework. And then what we need to know is, do you like the homework that we've done? And do you want us to keep proceeding? And then similarly on these other things, I would expect if we come back to you with a regional fare policy recommendation, the same question would happen about cost. Like, right, do we expect this to increase ridership? Do we expect this to have an impact on cost? And like, what is that circumstance? What we can't do today is quantify that for you, but what we will do in the coming months, where directed and charged, is work on those items to be able to bring you more of that information in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Sargent. Mr. Donahue, Co-Chair Allen, followed by Chair Ehrlich.
Thank you. I find myself churning inside a lot during conversations like this because we have a table full of the top elected leaders for our region, the top executive leadership across the region, and my churning happens when we're repeating some of the same things I feel like many of us have probably talked about for years and years and years. Who does not want fast, frequent, reliable, affordable service? Who does not want to improve wayfinding? Who does not want to have improved customer service? Part of what I want this effort to be is to really actually have some of those concrete recommendations that are actionable, both from those of us that are legislators, those of us that are executive leaders. And so I was going to direct a question to Mr. Hill and Mr. McDougall. I will still be churning inside, I know a lot. But what do you need from the collective group here? What do you need us to push the representatives that are on advisory groups to be able to move beyond some of the, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but the generality kind of comments and goals to getting more specific and more urgent. If we're going to be meeting again in November, I do not want us to be sitting here talking about how we all agree we want to have more fast, frequent, reliable, affordable service. We do. So how are we going to get there? How can we help the advisory groups? I would like to hear if you can do, what do you need from us? What do you need to hear us say? Where do you need us to push to be able to have that November timeframe be as fruitful as we think it can be?
So a couple reactions to that question, and going back to Chair Randall, one of the things that you said is that this is a regional asset, and it empowers our region to do certain things. And so having this task force together to empower us to deal with these solutions regionally is really critical and important. And so how do we think about what that looks like? You know, we've been handed something that was created in the 60s. Our world has changed pretty dramatically. And so we should be thinking very creatively about what the solutions need to be as we go forward and what that looks like. And so I think it's, I think acknowledgement here and permission to really push the envelope as much as possible as we start to think through these different issues. You know, cost is, yeah, we want to know more about cost. We want to understand cost. We want to understand from a business community perspective, and I think the community group at large is that we want to understand what is our return on investment. You know, are we doing enough? Are we doing too much? I don't think we can answer those questions.
I'll just say for me, permission granted. If we are not thinking big, acting boldly, this is not a great use of our time. So I want you to help feel empowered to lead those advisory groups to think big and bold, and with as much urgency as possible.
Okay, that works. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Excellent points. Chair Ehrlich. Oh.
I agree with Mr. McDougall. Unfettered access and a script to what we decide is what we want to be. In my view, looking at the finances as our secretary, deputy secretary in Virginia, we always look at the finances, but it's also, somebody needs to tell us what service you want to have and what service we can provide and how much it costs, right? So once I have unfettered access to the books as well as your minds to showcase what it is that we want to be and how we want to get there, we can provide all of that for you. I mean, we are nibbling around the circle, and I appreciate you stating what you stated. I have a chairman in Fairfax who's going to be driving home with me telling me all these things that he wants, and we talk about it a lot, but we really need to hear others say the same, and we don't. So if you can get us to that point, that's great.
Thank you. Chair Ehrlich.
No, go ahead.
That's right. Okay. So I was on the TPB for a long time when I was a council member, probably all 12 years, and have been very involved in just planning in the county. We did a ton of master plans over 12 years. And we're trying to implement a bus rapid transit system at a pretty large scale. But what I find missing, and missing in our own jurisdiction as well, there are a lot of metrics in the manual that comes out of the, I forget the name of the group in the National Academy of Sciences. There's a whole manual on bus rapid transit, for example, TRB. Whole manual on this, and it talks about a lot of things you need to do to get ridership. And And I think we'd all philosophically agree with that. But the problem that I've consistently seen is that we don't set targets for riders based on what kind of long-term mode share split we're trying to achieve. And that's critical because the COG projections for what the roads are going to look like is an absolute disaster. And that will spill over to the effectiveness of any kind of transit, particularly if we're running it on the surface. And I don't know how we get to a place without asking ourselves, how many people do I need to move into Bethesda, for example, in 2 hours between 7 and 9 o'clock in the morning? What mode share split do I need to achieve, and how much of a transit system do I need to design to deliver those many people there? That goes to fare box issues. We're not running buses as fully as we could, even in the county we're not. And when I would calculate what we were calling frequent service, I couldn't get anywhere near the number of people who had to arrive in Bethesda off of our definition of frequent service. And I think you've got to factor that into an evaluation of whether what it's going to take to make a system work. You automatically get riders if you start achieving mode share splits. And when I first introduced BRT to the commercial sector in Montgomery County, they were okay with mode share splits on the condition that transit was in place first, that you didn't then try to impose a mode share that couldn't be achieved by the transit system because nobody would get there. But they're actually more than happy to deal with lower mode share splits or higher mode share splits, depending on your perspective, if the transit's in place. And so I feel that, part of what we've got to identify is for our key areas, which consume most of the transportation going into business centers, what do we need to move there within the 2-hour period or 2.5-hour period? What kind of mode share would that take? And then how many vehicles do I need to do that? I could fill up a metro bus just going to Bethesda, or metro train going just to Bethesda. I could take a whole lot of people out then who would be trying to get into downtown DC. So if you don't have an adequate bus system riding on top, and I appreciate Metro's support, by the way, for building BRT on top of Wisconsin Avenue. There were people who said, why are you doing that? You got a Metro there. We're doing it because Metro can't handle delivery to Bethesda and delivery to DC at the same time out of the same population base that's along that corridor. So how do we incorporate that in how we think?
Right. Thank you, Mr. Ehrlich. Senator Serville, and we have Ms. Klein, and a final comment by Ms. Fernandez, and then we're going to move on.
Thank you. I think last meeting we had, I mentioned this, and I haven't heard it mentioned again, but about 5, 6, 7 years ago, I was playing around eBay for some reason. I ran across some tokens from some of the old transit systems in this area, and I went out and tried to collect all of them and discovered all the various bus services, I guess, that used to run around here until the system was consolidated. I want to say like maybe the 60s or 70s into WMATA. And, it's interesting to me, when I grew up, I used to take the Metro to get to the National Airport in DC. It was the only way I could get out of my house. But now, of course, we have a local bus service, and we've gone from having a whole bunch of services consolidated. Now we have, whatever it is, 24 local systems trying to coordinate with WMATA at the same time. And the thing I brought up last time is it's not clear to me why we're not talking about having some consolidations, getting some of these local services back into WMATA, because it's not clear to me how you can coordinate between 20-some systems at once. It just seems to me the world is a lot simpler if we had one system negotiating everything and managing everything at once. And I know that in the 80s, whatever, everybody wanted to be cost conscious and start controlling their own things and cramp down on labor costs or whatever and have their own system so they could control things instead of paying money into WMATA and having to negotiate that. But it just strikes me that one solution to having a better functioning system is to have one system. And when I've gone to when I've traveled to when I was just in Tokyo a couple of years ago, been to Munich, all these other places, they don't have, all these different local systems you have to try to figure out and navigate when you try and get around a world-class city. You buy one ticket and you go from one train to one bus and whatever, and it's simple. And I just think that from my perspective, not being from local government, I don't have a vested interest in that piece of it. That seems to me to be something that's on the table. And then the other thing I just want to mention is, similar to that, I haven't seen any goal or anything on here about the people working in the system, making sure they're fairly compensated, fairly treated.
Is it? I must have blown by that, but, okay. But I know, for example, we're facing a potential another strike here at one of these systems in Northern Virginia. This keeps coming up because they're not being compensated at the same levels as the WMATA employees are, and that's going to continue to be a problem. And every time we have a labor disruption, that just creates more consternation about usage of the system and people want to use it. So I'm not sure that that's really has been part of this discussion today or whether it's going to be, but just it seems intuitive to me.
Thank you, Mr. Serville. Ms. Klein, followed by Ms. Fernandez, final comment.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is working, yes. Sarah Klein, I'm one of the federal directors on the WMATA board. And I just wanted to make an observation, which is this work is incredibly important, and I really appreciate everything that's gone into it. What we're doing, though, in this section is the cost efficiency part of the work, which I agree should be the baseline for everything that we're doing. But one thing I sort of see is a disconnect between this conversation and what the customers in this region and potential customers have told us that they want, which is more service and more frequent service. And I want to make sure, I guess, that we don't kind of lose sight of that ultimate goal. We did the survey, we heard from people, not just in this survey, but in every survey we've ever done, more service and more frequent service comes up at the top. So the cost efficiency and the working jointly to make sure that we're using our existing assets as efficiently as possible and as cost effectively as possible is foundational and really important. I don't want to minimize that, but I do also think that, I guess it's a question, for the task force chairs. Is there a process for getting to that next step of how we really do meet what the region has told us they want?
Thank you, Ms. Klein. Ms. Fernandez, last comment.
Thanks to all of you for that feedback. There were a couple of things that I'll just go through very quickly in the interest of time. Again, Mr. McKay, thank you so much for raising about the survey. It's important because we're getting that feedback from external individuals. 62% are not current users of public transportation for commute. So this was very important for them to take the time and share with us what would move them from their cars to that. The second question, I can't remember who brought it up, but it was on the whole looking at the system of network of public transportation, but that public transportation, especially bus, operates on roads with cars and delivery trucks and others. So it's holistic. We have decision makers at the county level, at state and city and county DOTs that have the power of that bigger picture. And that's one of the reasons they're at the table, and we're looking forward to getting and gaining data on how we can create that balance and mobility. And as it relates to the workforce, public transportation is experiencing a silver tsunami. So it's not only taking care of those who are here, but making sure that there's continuous hiring and training so that we can retain the employees, reskill and upskill those who are here so they can meet the new challenges of the new technology. There's
yeah, thank you, Ms. Fernandez. Nope, we're good. We're gonna collapse 4 and 5. We know we're running over, and I know we have people with 2 o'clock hard stops, some of them. So Chair Allen, we're gonna take it from here.
Absolutely. Mr. Smedberg and I agree that meetings should end when we said they're going to end. So to accomplish that, what we're going to do, it's been a great discussion, a lot of good questions, but we're going to collapse items 4 and 5 rather than breaking them up, which I think also is a little bit, helps us the way we just had this conversation, which really maybe should have been together. We're going to have item 4 and 5 together, just so everybody's prepared. I've also asked Nick Donahue, because each of you already has each slide in front of you, so Nick does not need to read each and every slide for the very thing you have in front of you. So I'm going to ask him to move quickly through that so we'll have plenty of time for robust discussion, because I can't imagine there'd be any conversation whatsoever about dedicated transit funding, but we'll make sure there's some time left for that. So, Mr. Donahue, let me turn to you.
Well, thank you, Chair Allen, and I now know why I'm sitting next to you in case I go too slow. You'll help remind me. So just a kind of a quick thing, the task force asked the advisory groups, in addition to the various things that Ms. Fernandez walked through, to start looking at and evaluating funding needs and potential ways to address what those needs may be. So I'm just going to quickly run through a few things here. So what do we need to try and fund or cover through DMVMoves? So remember, we have an existing transit system in this region with a variety of different agencies. We also have potential enhancements, as Ms. Klein kind of referenced, that people may want to be able to make sure transit in this region is meeting our needs. As we think about DMVMoves, we both need funding for the existing system. And then for any potential enhancements, clearly, other funding would be needed to help arrive and provide that level of service. So just a quick recap here on what are we doing today and how is transit funded, in this region. In FY25, there's about $3.5 billion that's spent for transit operating costs. 70% of that's at WMATA. WMATA represents about 85% of all ridership. I think the important thing just to kind of note here, and this is stating the obvious, if you look at the charts down at the bottom there, you can see that the passenger revenue has clearly gone down kind of dramatically since 2019 to now. Again, we're starting to see some improving transit ridership, but we are still not back at where we were in 2019 levels. On capital, we're spending a substantially similar amount as we are on operating, and again, WMATA is about 70% of that. The thing I'd ask you to kind of look at the bar charts at the bottom, and this is going to be really important for some of the future slides as we talk about it, is in 2019, you can't even see kind of that other column. It's like 2% or something up there. And then at 2024 and 2025, you see that light green kind of line, diagonal line area. That is debt, for the most part, backed by the 2018 dedicated regional funding for WMATA. And so we have successfully increased capital spending in this region since 2018 with the establishment of that dedicated funding, and that's been done for a lot of parts through debt financing to be able to really try and go after the state of good repair backlog at WMATA. Oh, sorry, clicked the wrong way. So we're going to be talking about a few different potential funding scenarios today. The important thing about this is these each build upon each other. So you can't pick just number 4 and say, I want to do number 4. You have to fund number 1 before you can get to number 2, and so on and so forth. And so just keep that in mind when you see the numbers. The other thing is when I go through the numbers that you see for scenario 2 include the cost of scenario 1. So please don't add those together. It's already kind of baked in there as we move forward. And today we are only talking about really kind of state of good repair and funding the existing system, as well as enhancements that can be done with the assets that are in place today. In future meetings, we'll get to some of the things that Ms. Klein kind of referenced about modernization and expansion and kind of enhancements beyond the existing system that we have. But we wanted to make sure everyone had an understanding of this level before we kind of went to that next step. So with no further ado, scenario 1, and again, a quick reminder, what we're talking about here is addressing the state of kind of staying where we are in terms of state of good repair at WMATA and other transit systems, and then also funding the existing level of service. So we're not running any new service. There's still some state of good repair things that wouldn't be addressed, but this is kind of, we have what we have today. What would it cost us to continue doing this into the future? And I should say, these numbers do represent all transit agencies in the region. So COG staff worked with WMATA staff as well as all of the other operators here to kind of compile this information and look at both operating and capital needs. It's about $480 million at WMATA is the need. And again, that's an amount that would grow over time with inflation. And at the local agencies, it's about $165 million. And similarly, that amount would grow over time. In both cases, the majority of this is actually capital. So of that total need, about 70% of this is capital, and it's a much smaller share kind of on the operating side. So the second scenario that the advisory groups looked at was, scenario 1 plus improving service with your existing assets. So with this, we're not buying new rail cars to increase the number of rail cars. We're not buying new buses to have more buses, but we are using buses that maybe run during peak periods but don't run at the off-peak or other things of that nature, and similar with rail cars, to increase the service that is otherwise provided in the region. There are also still some things that may not be included in here that people might want to see, but you can see the list of what is in there. The total funding gap, again, in FY28 for this is $835 million, so it's an increase of about $235 from scenario 1. That is all on the operating side, because again, there's no additional capital investment in the scenario because we are still funding the same level of state of good repair and then just using the existing assets we have more fully, if you will, to provide greater levels of service throughout the day. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the capital needs, particularly on the SGR side, and kind of why we're having this discussion today. As you all know, the region came together in 2018 to provide the $500 million in dedicated regional funding for WMATA. That has been successful. So a lot of good work has been done using those dollars. You can see capital spending at WMATA has doubled during that time period. And what we all saw through the LaHood report and other analysis back in the day is that funding at WMATA for capital expenses was not going up as the system was reaching the end of its useful life. This was very, very important thing to do. I want to note there is still a state of good repair backlog. You never really get to the end of the state of good repair backlog, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we've made very, very good progress through the dedicated capital funding at WMATA. However, we're approaching kind of this point, though, that we all kind of knew existed in 2018, which was at a certain point, after you sell a lot of debt with that dedicated regional funding, because it's a fixed amount of funds, you can't sell any more debt for a period of time. And so what happens in the FY 28-29 timeframe is we essentially reach the end of the borrowing capacity of the dedicated regional funding. That then results in a corresponding decrease in the WMATA capital program, and you can see the projections that WMATA has put together here as to what that would do to the state of good repair backlog. And effectively, after some period of time, what it would really do is bring us back to where we were before 2018, kind of in those mid-2010s when I was a daily writer at that time, and I think we all know how the system functioned, and it functions a lot better today than it did at that time frame. What I want to kind of note importantly is in scenario one, the WMATA capital need from a funding standpoint to kind of address state of repair in the existing system was $340 million. If we had indexed the dedicated regional funding in 2018 to inflation, and similarly if the PREA federal kind of funding and the local match had been indexed to inflation, that's about $340 million. And so if we had that amount and it was a growing amount over time, just like the base budget, that would enable WMATA to continue to sell debt, ideally in a kind of to get to a revolving way where it's a sustainable program. And that line, instead of shooting up, as you see in the back half of that graph, stays kind of where it is and potentially even starts to go down again, depending on cost and other, world events there. But we're having this discussion today in large part because major capital funding sources for WMATA were fixed dollar amounts that have lost a lot of their purchasing power over time. And if we can restore that purchasing power with funding sources that grow, that will address the kind of the state of good repair needs by keeping us where we are today. Again, that doesn't cover everything. I want to really stress that, and that does not get into enhancements to the system or other things of that nature, but it would make this red line stay where it is today or potentially even go down, which is a lot better than what the current projections are with where things stand today. So the other point I was just making on state of good repair is those needs never go away. It is an ongoing thing with an operating transit system. So again, there's public-facing things like rail cars that the public can see, and they now see the legacy rail cars have been replaced. There's also things they don't see, like a bus maintenance facility or other things of that nature that are really important to the service that's run, where we still have kind of ongoing work that has to be completed. And so again, this is an ongoing thing. You never get to the end of state of good repair. It is kind of a continual investment that's required over time. And then the last point that I'll make, and clearly if you have any questions, I'll turn it back to Chair Allen, this is not unique to WMATA, the circumstance that we're kind of talking about today, or to the other transit operators in this region. So on this slide, you can just see some of the other larger transit systems throughout the country and the deficits and shortfalls that they are facing. I'm sure in each agency there's something unique, just like there is here, beyond national trends that helps explain their number. But the point I want to make here is we are seeing this across the country in all of the major transit systems, and so we are not unique in the situation that we're facing. Oh, and so
we're going to collapse the two. So
okay, perfect. All right, so just this point here, just kind of getting to the idea that we're all in this together. So this requires work from the transit agencies. This requires hopefully some increased commitment from the federal government. It may also involve over time asking things of users of the system, but also ask of the jurisdictions in terms of resources here. And so the transit agencies need to do their role and their part in terms of cost controls, finding ways to try and increase ridership with the resources that are provided to them. But we also then need to talk to the jurisdictions about what are the resource levels they're providing there, as well as looking at the users of the system and our federal government partner in DC. And so, Mary, I think you were gonna, is this your slide?
Thank you, Nick. I saw that everyone was following along. So yes, it's a lot of information, but it's necessary information to understand where we are, how we got here, and then what the needs are. I think the bottom line is that we need to start thinking about how to create that vision, turn that vision into a reality, and that's going to take funding, of course, because we know how far the current dollars can go. I just wanted to, again, emphasize the importance of leadership. This is going to start a lot of conversations. Some of them are going to be hard and difficult, but the conversation needs to get started, or we'll be right back here again 20 years from now, and I'll be in a rocking chair, so I won't be joining you. But nonetheless, since we have made this commitment, we need the leadership. We need everyone to work together through a partnership. It's not just one jurisdiction that is now going to be taking the lead or dealt to take that lead, but everyone coming together. So the conversation, with all of this background that we have shared with you all, the conversation now is going to go shift to, what's next? What are some of these next steps? We have heard you, and we totally agree and appreciate that you have concurred with the vision and with the goals, that you like the direction of creating this action, bring this action plan back to you all with details on who is going to do what and by when, and that there is another ask that we will be following up on, and that is, what are the benefits, and can we get an estimate on what some of those cost savings are? But now let's talk about the reality of operating service in this region, of making sure that we can not only achieve the world class, but that we continue to ensure that we're on a path to get to world class. So the conversation now will kind of shift to both of the task force chairs.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Again, I assume this is going to generate a good amount of discussion, so we'll use our table tents, and I'll make sure we keep a lineup. I'll start with a couple of quick things. One, I appreciate, Nick, you walking us through all of this, and I know we moved through it quickly, but again, everybody has the slides in front of you if you need to refer back to anything. To me, I think it's incredibly important, and I appreciate Nick highlighting the fact that when we're talking about the gaps that we are going to have to be funding, because we're fresh off of a large conversation around WMATA gaps, that again, we are talking about our entire region and all of transit. So when you look at that, kind of first scale of a combined $645 million, that is both WMATA and other transit in the region, right? So WMATA makes up 480 of that, the rest is 165. When we looked at that scenario, that second part of that pyramid, that's talking about 600 from WMATA, 235 from the rest of the region. So I just want to kind of remind us of that oftentimes when we talk transit, we're leaning heavily on WMATA, rightfully so, but this is about the entire region. That's what those numbers make up. The other part is that as we look at this, I hope every good policymaker likes to see a big menu in front of them. The slide that you see in front of you right now, talking about different potential mechanisms, every single one of those has pros and cons, every single one of them. And so part of our charge, I think, as we are trying to work collectively as a region and with leadership, is try to help think about what our options are, recognizing there are pros and cons with every single decision we make. And we could go down the rabbit hole, we're not going to today, of trying to drill down on one specific item and just spend all our time just circling that one. Our hope for this part of the conversation is to maintain it at a little bit higher level. You'll see on the next slide, for example, we talk about what are the questions for this discussion? What are the criteria as a region that we should be using to prioritize when selecting reliable, sustainable funding for transit? And I hope that's part of what you'll keep in mind as we enter this part of the conversation. The other is, again, it's a big picture question. Should the region aim for a regional funding mechanism or a collection of state and local mechanisms that address the need? These are some pretty key fundamental questions that we as a group need to try to help answer, because that then helps inform where this group is going to go. It helps inform our advisory groups, but also helps inform the staff to then help come back with something if we're going to be able to achieve this. Personally, there are no efficiencies that can be gained that equal the gap that we have. I absolutely want to push WMATA and all of our transit agencies to find efficiencies and work smart and work better. But the reality is there is no way that efficiencies and savings make up for this. So I know I am prepared to say, yes, we have to figure out how do we fund our transit system. To me, it's an open question of what does that look like of our mechanisms and our tools. I believe a regional solution is one that we should be pursuing. I think it is one that can inspire us as a region. I think it is one that helps move us collectively as a region. I think it helps long-term put transit on a more stable and sustainable financing mechanism. The other thing I will say is that if we are going to go down that road, and I'm just speaking for myself at this moment, just that tier one, that bottom piece of the pyramid, if I have to go out and say, let's go find ways to raise revenue to give you the same thing you already got, I don't think that advances our cause, and I don't think it advances what we want to accomplish. I think improving service, as we say is a stated goal here, is part of what we want to be able to say we're achieving, and I think as policymakers, it also helps us aim and achieve for what we're trying to create. So I will stop now so I can help facilitate a lot of other questions. I see some cards have already gone up. So I think I saw Mr. Sargent, yours go up first, then Ms. Henderson, and then Mr. Collins, and I'll just keep a lineup going.
Thank you, Councilman. So just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So none of these figures include WMATA's current 450 to 750 deficit, correct? And it's just assumed that the states and localities are going to continue that emergency aid that's been provided?
So, Mr. Sargent, I'm going to rephrase the question to make sure I got it correctly for you, and then I will, if that's right, I'll then answer that. So I think what you're asking is, with the rebaselining that took place during the last budget cycle at WMATA, are those figures assumed in the base, or are they included in the amounts shown in scenarios 1 and 2? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. They are included in the base there, so they are not. Let's assume that that is below kind of the line, if you will, and then the scenarios 1 and 2 are both on top of that. I think, again, as we kind of stated there, we do understand that jurisdictions may approach that how they fund the rebaselining different in different places, and that every jurisdiction, state and local, have a unique way in which they may pursue addressing the rebaselined budget.
Got it. That is a whopper of an assumption, I would just say, so everyone, in this position, Virginia, we have a biennial budget, so we've already allocated next year as well, but those general funds, that's going to have to be part of this discussion as well. So I would just say to everyone, keep in mind, you've got to add another $450+ million to this price tag, unless you found a recurring funding source for this fiscal year.
Thank you, Mr. Sargent. Ms. Henderson?
Thank you, Chair Allen. I wanted to ask, is the hope that the jurisdictions will choose the same dedicated funding source or a combination of the same? I'm asking because for some of these potential mechanisms, for instance, like it wouldn't generate a lot in the district, the fuel tax or the motor vehicle sales tax, but it might do very well for Maryland and Virginia. I do like the idea from a communication standpoint of there being some regional narrative in terms of everyone sort of doing the same thing, but I'm kind of curious how we're going to get to that point of talking about, some of these might work better than others in certain jurisdictions.
I think it's a great question. I can ask our facilitators as well. I think you're exactly right, that if you look at this list that is up there, and again, it's not an exhaustive list, it will generate different amounts in different jurisdictions. I would say, from my perspective, everything's on the table of trying to look at this. And also, when I said earlier, each thing has a pro and a con, that's a great example. That some of these might generate some might generate a lot. Some might generate some very differently in different jurisdictions. Other parts of the questions we should be asking, who are we asking? Who ultimately is actually paying this? And who are we asking, and is that a fair way to do this? So I think everything's on the table, but I think that's part of the realistic effect that you talk about. Some of them are going to generate more than others, and perhaps inequitably or unfairly across the region as well. And so I think that's part of the analysis. I think while we don't necessarily want to go down the rabbit hole of let's drill down on one specific mechanism today, I do think it's a healthy question to ask. When we say a regional funding source, are we talking about a singular funding source that the whole region would get into? Or is it that there is a regional package that might look a little bit different? And what are the pros and cons of each of those approaches? I don't know if Neri or Nick, if you had anything to add to that.
Yes, I just wanted to add, and thank you, that's a great question. Again, this list was labeled potential, so we're not being prescriptive. But more importantly, the information that's necessary for the advisory group members to start to narrow down opportunities and potentials are part of the conversation here today. It's like if we think about one source, and that source is going to have pros and cons, and it's volatile, it's best to think about a group of sources. But then that decision will be made by you all, and we will have to bring additional information. We want to highlight the need to start focusing on it's going to take more revenues than we currently received, and it's going to take more than just what has been currently committed to as part of the designated funding.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to Mr. Collins next. And the lineup I've got so far is Mr. Collins, Mr. McKay, Mr. Surville, Mr. DiFernetti, and Ms. Klein, and Dr. Lowe.
Thank you, Chair Allen. The benefit I think Maryland brings to the table is that funding for Metro is in its general operating budget. So it's allocated, and that gives us a starting point. The suggestion that I would make, and I have to preface this somewhat because Mr. Donahue and your comments earlier kind of muzzling the comments I'd like to make, because I'd like to talk more in terms of expansion and looking at it from that perspective. But as it relates to funding in the state of Maryland, the biggest challenge has always been how do you allocate and seek funding from those jurisdictions that are presently not within the ridership of Metro. That's a major challenge. I get it personally because of the economic development impact and potential that exists, and I think that has been a strong point that our legislature has used, and that's why Maryland has been solidly funding Metro. A suggestion and something to explore, and I'm glad Senator Augustine and Mr. McAndrew are here today, is looking at creating incentives for local jurisdictions to buy into additional funding for Metro. And the first thought I have, particularly when you're talking about the Eastern Shore and these locales within the state that have absolutely no access to rail or Metro on any level, is seeing a reduction in the gasoline tax, and that's and its impact on road construction. Now, everything that we talk about is certainly moving beyond the necessity of road construction, but the reality is, and I'm sure the same thing applies in the state of Virginia as well, in many jurisdictions, they absolutely want and seek additional funding for road construction, and which creates a dilemma. I would like to explore, and certainly looking at it from the vantage point of the legislature, how can we create incentives to encourage that buy-in from those local jurisdictions that may not have accessibility to Metro, but at the same time create maybe like an incentive package or something to encourage, if this is done, then that could possibly be an avenue for additional funding, which could, enhance your road construction. I mean, and I look forward to talking in more detail about expansion ideas, because I think there are a lot of potential opportunities that exist in terms of expansion, particularly in the Southern Maryland region. So,
thank you, Mr. Collins. Mr. McKay?
First of all, just in response for a moment to something Mr. Collins brought up, I agree entirely. We should be looking at areas outside the compact if we can, because there are areas that do not pay into Metro today whose residents get huge benefits out of Metro. And so I do think that's something that should remain on the table. I know it's controversial, but the point is taken. I guess the thing I would emphasize here is that so much of Metro's ridership depends on the services provided by non-Metro entities. We talked earlier about what would happen if Metro took over all the bus service. Well, if one day we decided bus service was no longer a priority in our jurisdiction, you would see Metro ridership tumble. And I bring that up because I think what is very important to me in terms of looking at criteria is that we look at the revenues that would be needed to support transit in the region by jurisdiction as a driver. Because one of the challenges Metro has is the uncertainty of what we're going to do, at least on Virginia's side, and I think it's fair to say in the district in Maryland too, in terms of ridership or cost reductions or route configuration changes based on our own budgets. And so if whatever revenue source we identify could pick up the cost of other local transit service that right now is covered by local governments, you would get the benefit of better long-term planning and a better idea of what funding would be available for those support systems, whether they're run by Metro or run by local governments. And there's another slide in here, I can't find it now, but I know I saw it earlier today in the thick packet that talks about the financial challenges local governments are facing. If we could lift this cost out of our general fund and give Metro the benefit of long-term planning, knowing that revenue was there, would be very helpful to us in terms of supporting transit in general long-term, which supports Metro in long-term. And so I just want us to think about transit and not just solving the Metro problem. And if we're going to go big in terms of what it is we're going to raise revenue for, we ought to be picking up in Virginia, VRE, and Maryland MARC expenses that are passed down to local governments and local transit service costs.
Thank you very much, Mr. McKay. Mr. Surville, I have you next, and then Mr. DiFernetti, Ms. Klein, Dr. Lowe, and then Senator Augustine.
Thanks. I think I forgot to introduce myself last time, but I'm again, Scott Surville, represent Eastern Fairfax County and the majority leader of the Virginia State Senate. So first of all, in terms of the bigger picture questions y'all asked, it strikes me that at least politically asking either people that don't live in the region or tourists to share part of the burden, I think has some positive aspects in terms of selling this to the broader community. And obviously the TOT tax, hotel occupancy tax, whatever, is one way to get at tourists. And there's another idea I'm going to mention in a second, which is another way to get out-of-towners wrapped in. But in terms of when I look at the list and trying to think of the right way to fund things, two big principles to me are, one is we should be trying to incentivize people to use transit. So what types of behaviors are we trying to make more expensive to sort of level the playing field between transit and driving a car, for example? And so I think that's one principle that ought to sort of guide things. Secondly, it strikes me that WMATA, the transit system itself, creates a lot of massive value in the private sector, which there's an opportunity to recapture either via like a special tax district or perhaps another way by leasing development rights over top of metro stations. And I think those ought to be, I don't see that on the list. I know there's been some development on top of metro stations, but I was just talking to somebody last week about the possibility of example of building on top of the Silver Line stations on the toll road, on platforms over the road, which I don't think a lot of people think about, but there are development opportunities over those stations that I think could enhance value and bring in revenue that I'm not sure we're fully maximizing. But, and I know the Silver Line was funded with both the tolls on the road and a special tax district around each station. And to that point, in terms of regional solutions, there's some inequities that arise because of some steps that have already been taken. So for example, like I just said, we already have special tax districts at least around every Silver Line station. So if we were to do that over every station, that in some way prejudices the Silver Line stations because they have yet an additional tax on top of the tax they already have, whereas maybe in other stations in Maryland or other parts of Fairfax, they're not doing that. And so that has to be sort of taken into account to make sure you're not going to disincentivize development over some stations versus others. And so that's a balance you have to look at. Similar to that, I know one of the issues with the sales tax, which I think there's a certain elegance to having a regional sales tax solution, but it's my understanding that Maryland taxes different things in the sales tax than Virginia does. And until we have, I know Maryland took some steps to modernize their sales tax a few years ago. We haven't done that in Virginia. We tried this last session. The governor hated it, and we got bogged down in that. And so it's just another variable I think we have to think about in terms of fairness to the revenue if we're going to make sure we're taxing all the same things when we do a sales tax. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention and throw out there is that it strikes me that over the river right now, there's, at least in driving my car, I sense there's 3 major pinch points. There's the American Legion Bridge, 395. Every time I go to a Nats game, I get stuck in that. And then the Wilson Bridge down in my area. And those bridges, to me, present opportunities to capture revenue to help fund transit. And I know that currently we have a hot lane over 395. It's not heavily used, but it's at least there. I take it to get to my Nats games sometimes coming from work. But Maryland and Virginia are currently at loggerheads over whether to push the toll lanes into over the American Legion Bridge and also over the Wilson Bridge. And if that ever happens, it strikes me that those are excellent opportunities to put some kind of a minimum tax on cars as they go over the river to get more money into the transit system instead of people using their cars. And so it just seems to me that that ought to be part of the solution, and maybe that's more about the expansion solution than the operating solution. But it just strikes me those are some things and ideas that I have out there in terms of trying to prioritize and think about these things.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. DiFernetti, let me turn to you next.
With respect to the next slide and the 2 questions, you mentioned regional, and I think Ms. Henderson has a great point in that there's sort of how you calculate a regional share of a tax, and then there's how you get there, because Maryland state funded, and we've got the Dillon rule. Whether all legislators in Virginia want the Dillon rule, we got it. So I guess I would, with respect to that question, I'd be inclined towards a both and. You know, you could have a regional mechanism for assessing how much we might need that therefore could be indexed, and you could have different ways of funding it. And then with respect to the first question, I mean, the long list, you know, I don't think many would question that there's some taxes that are, when the economy is good, they're very, very good. And when the economy is bad, they are very bad. And so I think we have to be looking at multiple sources in order to reach the funding that we need to be sort of sustainable and not subject to extraordinary variability. The last point I would make is that, you know, on the right side, you know, the 500 million is living proof that we have to have something that's indexed. We can't be doing this again and again and again, and so a percentage, and even as you think about like the real estate transfer fee, I don't know how to make that an indexed, but we need to be thinking if we were to use that particular source, I think we should have agreement on indexing.
Thank you very much. Excellent points. Ms. Klein, I'm going to you next, and then Kevin Donahue, I saw your tent up, so I've got you after Mr. Augustine.
All right, thank you. We're doing a little microphone juggling. Excuse me for a moment. Put this in a reasonable place. There we go. I wanted to echo the comments that Councilmember Allen made, and also what Mr. DiFernetti just said. We've talked about a regional funding source, but we haven't really defined what that means. And I don't think that we can today answer the question, should we have a regional funding mechanism? Because that could mean everybody does the exact same thing, or it means we have a regional entity that is the collector and distributor, or it could mean we have a set of regional principles that determine basically principles for what each jurisdiction's funding mechanism should meet. I mean, there's a variety of ways to think about it. I do think that since we spent the first hour of this meeting kind of retrofitting a regional approach to our service in the region, because organically we've sort of, you know, developed a situation where many jurisdictions kind of have their own thing. We have a regional and national asset in WMATA. I don't want us to be in the position in 20 years to be trying to retrofit a regional approach to our funding. So doing it now is the right idea, but I do think we need a little more definition of the options that fall under the regional funding approach, and ways to think about that. And the other thing I just wanted to say is, I know we're a very unique region, and I'm always recognize that when I'm working nationally with other transit systems. But other transit systems have raised money in different ways. Sales tax is, I think, by far the most common. And they've dealt with issues of disparities in how much different parts of their regions would raise. And they're not state to state. They're, you know, this county would do this and this county would do that. I think we might be able to learn a lot from the approaches that are in other places, or just give us some ideas of how different places have chosen to raise their money in a way that works for them, and see if there's something we can learn as we strive toward a regional approach here.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to ask Mr. Donahue here to do a quick response.
Thank you, Chair Allen. So, Ms. Klein, to your point, I think there's 4 general options, and I should say there's definitive nuances you could kind of add to those. So I think you hit on 2, but I also just wanted to say 2 other ones for kind of the group's benefit as you all continue in this discussion. So clearly there's like a regional source that could be the same, or multiple ones that go straight to WMATA, and you've talked about that. Another variant on that is you raise similar revenue streams regionally and you send it to a different entity who then can disperse to WMATA and other transit agencies. And those are kind of like the 2 where the revenues are raised and they're sent kind of to someone that's not the state or NVTC or MDOT or DDOT or something of that nature. A step kind of below that as well is you could do the 2018 model, where everybody did kind of their own funding source, but the commitment had no relationship to the WMATA funding formula and the annual budget process. So it was kind of dedicated funding through quote unquote like a lockbox, for lack of a better term, that wasn't about service factors. And then the final kind of concept below that is like, you have the annual budget process in the formula. Depending on how you structure that, the ability to sell bonds is very, very, very different. So I would respectfully suggest that if you go to the funding formula, it's very difficult to sell bonds. That's why we all structured the 2018 funding package in a slightly different concept. And so we need to be able to leverage whatever this revenue source is to sell debt. And so in my mind, when we talk about what are some of the structural options that exist, it's the 2018 model up to some of those regional models there. Again, fully agnostic as to what it is, but once you get to something below that 2018 model in terms of dedication, the ability to sell debt and the interest rates that you'll pay, it just gets harder and more expensive. And so I just wanted to kind of put those out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Lowe.
Okay, so just to add to what was just said, you know, the criteria, it sounds like bondable, like obviously, and that it, you know, it needs to be big enough and it needs to grow as the region grows. I think I'm hearing that from a lot of people. I don't think that we should get like 100% bogged down really early on in regional solution or collection of state and local mechanisms, because it actually we could just make this even more precious and complicated, and it could be both, right? Like we could basically like run the math, figure out how much of a sales tax we think is like feasible for the region to bear, realize it's not going to raise the amount of money we want, and then say, okay, we're still going to do that. We're still going to do the regional thing, and we're going to need to do like another thing. So this could be a very diverse capital stack. I think that the next challenge is really that we have to talk about the capital vision if we want to get to the top of the pyramid, right? So like if the pyramid is like eating at Benihana, and right now we're talking about like the rice course that comes right at the beginning, we want to get to the shrimp at the top. And so we need to talk more about what might be in the capital vision. All that WMATA has put forward is like our blue, orange, silver study, which is like a lot of money. And I want to hear more ideas that are more bite-sized amounts of money for ways that we can invest in expanding the transit network that we have that aren't necessarily just about WMATA, that are things that we can actually afford and figure out how to do. There was a great article in Greater Washington last week about what bus priority on the 90 route could do, right? For example, it's like doable, like hard enough. And so I want to hear more ideas like that, more bite-sized things. Do we have those ideas? If not, how are we going to get them? Because we need to know what they are in order to even make a guess at how much they might cost in order to pay for them. And so then finally, you know, one last remark about slide 19. Right, and to Ms. Klein's idea that we look at how other transit agencies are raising revenue. We can see, however they're doing it, they're not raising enough. But I want to flag for everyone that there is one transit agency in the United States that, like us, has higher than 5% regional transit mode share, and that is not on this table because it does not have an operating deficit, and that's Sound Transit. So we know that this problem is huge, but it's solvable because someone did solve it. What has never been done is no one has ever solved this regional transit funding problem across a state line. We can see lots of multi-state jurisdictions on this list of people who still have a problem, right? So this is a challenge, but it's also an almost unbelievable opportunity. Because if we could be the first region to solve this across state lines, our global competitiveness relative to all of these other regions is instantly, we're playing chess, they're playing checkers. So I hope that as we get into how nitty-gritty and messy and complicated this is going to be, that we don't give up. Let's keep this momentum going and figure this out, because it is possible. We can do it, and it would be a huge W if we did.
Thanks. Mr. Augustine, did you next? Did you take her? All right. I've got Kevin Donahue, Mark Ehrlich, and then we're going to be at time, so we'll need to wrap up there. Mr. Donahue?
Thank you. I'm Kevin Donahue, City Administrator for the district here on behalf of Mayor Bowser. I have a recommendation, but also just a problem I think about as I listen, and I call it the short, long-term problem. My short-term problem is, I'll go back to a comment that Mr. Sargent made, my job is to develop the budget to recommend to the mayor. I do have a shortfall this coming fiscal year. That's pretty meaningful. That in many ways does not at all relate to Metro, but some of it does. Metro made it easier on us by doing something that's probably not great long-term sound business, which is moving capital preventive maintenance money to the operating side to take the edge off of what it means for a local jurisdiction to be able to not have service reductions at Metro. So this next year, we have to raise our base subsidy more, even if that involves still moving preventive maintenance to operating, which is not a great long-term, sustainable long-term strategy. So the year after that, that amount goes up. So partly I struggled because I know to get to the better stuff, to get the enhanced stuff, I do have to work my way through quite a hill of additional subsidy. And I can either get that by raising revenue, by relying on organic growth of the economy, or by cutting services that are not called transit, cutting services throughout government. So that's just like it can be hard to sit here and think about the new stuff in 2028 when I know I have a budget due in a few months, and it's very hard to separate the two conversations. One, I would sort of, to me, put the elephant in the room that we also have budgets to construct over the next year or two that, in which I have to find money for transit, rightfully. I can't figure that out, except I'd like to just put what's in my head out on the table about trying to balance the short-term budget, which is next year's and the year afters, by also thinking about long-term. And then two just quick just recommendations that are highlight, I think, things that have said before. I would recommend everyone to think regionally. When you get to the peculiarities of who ought to owe what, you get into this impossibly deep hole of like what's fair that you never really emerge out of. So if you're starting with the basic premise that somehow in some way transit users, non-transit users, car users, people who never car or take transit benefit in some way from transit, it's a foundation that lets us not get into the hole of who ought to be paying that's not. So I would encourage us to think, one, regionally, and two, I do think we have to think big. Because if the premise, Councilmember Allen, you said, is to be able to show something people are getting out of it, I actually think definitionally you have to think big, because you're going to have to be able to address that which we have no choice but to do to be able to sustain transit and Metro service, then to get to the things that show people you're doing more. And so I would encourage us to think big and think regionally, but also recognize we have budgets coming up, and there's going to be hard choices in those upcoming budgets.
Yeah, I appreciate those points a lot. I think Mr. Clark wanted to do a quick response, and then I'll go to Mr. Ehrlich after that.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. Randy Clark, Metro GM. And I really, again, just reiterate how much, on the Metro team, we appreciate everyone digging into this topic and collaborating and partnering on this. A little bit to what Kevin mentioned. Obviously, we work incredibly closely with the CAO group specifically. And we understand your short versus long-term challenge. And we didn't go through the entire deck today, but obviously for the public at large, your staffs and others, there's a lot of stuff in there about cost management, things like variable versus fixed costs. I think that is an incredibly important thing that we'll spend more time on, which is all that to say, we're not cutting ourselves out of this topic. And I want to be crystal kind of clear with that, as loud as possible on that, I guess, and especially for the public at large. So a good example is last year we took it very serious, worked with the CAO group. We came up with a $50 million annual cut to our operating budget, not a one-time, $50 million annually without touching service. We raised fares pretty significantly on customers that haven't had a fare increase, and it's now at the level of inflation over the course of the entire part of Metro. We also saved $150 million in capital expense on our 6-year CIP. Last year, we were able to save $95 million to have surplus last year. And this week at our board meeting, we're going to show almost a $30 million surplus this year. There is very little, if you will, tricks left to play, things that we can do on the Metro side. If I had a magic $150 million I could cut, I would cut it tomorrow without even thinking about it. We're down to almost pure service. We just managed a 4-year CBA with our partner at 689. I really appreciate them coming to the table. All Metro staff took a 0% merit increase this year. Hard thing to do. We're a very competitive environment. We're performing at the best we've been, according to our customer satisfaction and data, in the history, or at least 10 years, and everyone took a 0. That's not going to happen next year, and we have to know that. So when it's all said and done, I just really want to highlight Kevin's piece, which is the capital money runs out in a couple years. We will not be able to do the transfer from preventive maintenance over, and we have about 2 years left to do that. So just really appreciate, Kevin, you bringing that to the table.
All right, thanks. Mr. Ehrlich, I've got you up next. I'm just cognizant of time. We'll have a couple of minutes left.
So I guess I'm looking at the list of things. Almost everything on that list would require the state of Maryland to agree to. The county has very limited taxing authority. I am trying to expand the taxing authority, but that would just let me build some of the basic things you've been able to do in Virginia that Montgomery County can't do. And that's my starting point. But I do think it makes sense to look at general sales tax. We'll probably be moving away from fuel taxes because this is going to be a dwindling amount of revenue forever, but some mileage taxes might make some sense. Real estate transfer fees, transit station area property taxes. I'm a big believer that the people who benefited most economically from Metro and didn't put anything into it ought to come to the table now. We should have taxing districts on them to help support Metro, which they have not done so far, but it has to be all of our jurisdictions. I think we have to avoid any one of us doing anything that's a heavy tax that nobody else does, because then we just make ourselves uncompetitive. And it's one of those things like, if I want to limit parking and nobody else limits parking, people are going to go to the jurisdictions that don't limit parking. So we got to make best policy practices that all of us can adapt to and live with. And so I hope we could put some numbers on some of these, even if they're very preliminary, just to get a sense of what a penny or a dollar costs in some of these scenarios, so we can start thinking about how do you make a menu out of this list.
I appreciate that a lot. I think one of the ideas was actually not to start the conversation with the menu, because I felt like that's going to, I know how that conversation would go. So being able to hear, like, this has been very helpful feedback to hear different principles stated, different ideas stated. That then I think helps the team then be able to come back and start thinking through, again, all of us here are different policymakers. We have to look at a menu of options, knowing all of them have pros and cons, and then try to evaluate what we think is the best option. Mr. Sargent, let me go to you. You said you want to make one last quick comment, and I'm going to turn to Ms. Fernandez for some of our next steps.
And I'll keep it quick. I know I had a lot of questions, but just wanted to speak to Mr. Donohue's point about the elephant in the room. And after listening today, kind of where I see this standing is that we don't yet have a clear, measurable objective of what we're trying to achieve, whether that's a specific mode share, number of trips we're trying to add. We don't yet have a plan as to how to fix Metro's current multi-$100 million budget deficit. We don't have a plan to address the region's highest in-class per-trip costs, but we do know exactly how much money we want. And here's a whole menu of taxes that we've picked out, and you guys can go and pick among these and try and raise that money. I mean, just speaking frankly, that is not something I can bring back to the governor's office because that is a non-starter. So I think there's a lot more work to do, just thinking more clearly about what we're trying to achieve, and then also just wrestling with what Mr. Donahue was saying, is that budgets are difficult and tough right now. And I think we need to think about how to make a more compelling vision in terms of addressing all of those things before also someone said taking this back to the public and making that a concrete ask of them to pay more for something that they've already been paying into for decades and decades.
All right, thanks, Mr. Sargent. I'm going to turn to Ms. Fernandez to give us some of our next steps. I've got a couple of quick closing remarks, turn to my co-chair for some closing remarks, and then we'll wrap ourselves up.
Yes, I wanted to, given all of the feedback that we've received today, I just wanted to bring us back to what the expectations are going forward. As I noted earlier, there is going to be another meeting of the task force that was added on November 14th. In the presentations today, we talked about scenarios 1 and 2. Nick reviewed those. We want to bring to you scenarios 3 and 4. But in addition to that, it's looking at the policy recommendations. We covered 6 policy recommendations. There's still ongoing work happening and some of the other areas that we believe will be able to generate the cost efficiencies. Again, going back to that. And that will be part of the discussion. Overall, we heard the bumper sticker is to be bold and to think bigger than we have ever thought, but that it needs to be a regional solution. Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to thank everybody for your time today. Appreciate everybody digging in for the constructive conversation here. To many of our advisory group members who aren't here but have been working over the last couple of months, appreciation as well. You know, I think we came away today with some clear action items that are going to feed into the next time we reconvene here. And that is, we see that our advisory groups are going to be meeting several times up until this November task force meeting. I think that it's clear, and I hope that Mr. Hill and Mr. McDougall heard us, and it sounds like they took that charge, is that the group is really looking now to have specifics that we can come back to on, as well as we need you to challenge us when you need that unfettered access, when you need us. You'll do that, and I hope everybody is committed to making sure that the teams we've tasked to do some of that work have it and have our support in doing it. But I know I'm looking for that very specific feedback and recommendations on that customer experience improvement, the administrative and cost efficiencies, the items that we outlined here, and I think they heard us when they asked for permission granted, to think big, to think bold, and I think that's an important part of this. I think you all also helped give really good feedback that will help inform the next conversation we have on funding and finance. There will be many, many arguments that we will all have around financing and on funding and how much and where, but laying out the framework here was helpful so that we could start to hear some of the common threads, common criteria, common assumptions that people would like to see. That helps put us in a better position to be successful moving forward. But again, my thanks to everybody here. Nick and Nuria, thank you for your hard work that you've been doing along the way as well. And let me turn to my co-chair to help wrap us up.
So very briefly, I want to thank all the members of the advisory group here. This has been really helpful. Your presence here today really does symbolize the significance and importance of this to our region. So I want to thank you for that. And also want to thank the COG and WMATA staff for all that they have done in preparing not only for the advisory group meetings, but for this meeting, or task force meetings, but for this meeting here as well. So thank you. And just one last note, our next task force meeting is Thursday, November 14th. So I want to make sure you have that on your calendar, and we'll be getting a notice out to you soon. Yeah. So thank you all very much.